Hello and welcome. Today's conversation brings together participating artists from the 2024 platform section titled Collective Memory. In this conversation, participating platform artists Dominique, Fung, and Sanford Biggers will be in discussion with Eugenie Tsai, the 2024 Focus Section Curator. While Nicholas Galanin was previously set to be in conversation this afternoon, he was unable to make it due to travel complications. Sanford Biggers' work is an interplay of narrative perspective and history that speaks to current happenings while examining the context that bore them. His diverse practice positions him as a collaborator with the past through explorations of often overlooked aesthetic, cultural, historical, and political narratives through his use of antique quilts and textiles, classical sculptures from around the world, sonic interventions, performances, and video. Dominique Fung is a Canadian artist with ancestry in Hong Kong and Shanghai whose practice explores the subliminal liminal territory in which tradition, memory, and legacy seep through our collective subconsciousness. Through her interest in casting light on often overlooked or forgotten stories and her use of specific historical artifacts she infuses with living qualities and complex nonlinear narrative paths, she models a new, broader, alternative space of belonging. Eugenie Tsai is a curator and writer based in New York. After 16 years, she recently stepped down from her position as the John and Barbara Vogelstein Curator of Contemporary Art at the Brooklyn Museum. During those years, she shaped the contemporary collection and organized around 40 loan and collection exhibitions. Thank you so much for being here today, and with that, I will turn the conversation over to Eugenie.
Thank you, Zoe. It's wonderful to see you all here, and it feels very special to close out the Armory show with this conversation. Sanford Biggers and Dominique Fung are two of the artists taking place in Platform, the section of the Armory show that presents large-scale sculpture and installations. For Platform, I was interested in presenting a group of artists whose work examines the intersection of memory, materials, and spirit. So I titled the section Collective Memory. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to hear two incredibly talented artists who are they're at different stages in their careers, and they will speak about their works on view and how these works relate to their overall practices. I have very abbreviated introductions to follow Zoe's. Sanford grew up in Los Angeles. He received a BA from Morehouse College in Atlanta and an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He attended Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in the late 1990s, and that's where we met. He has had many exhibitions in the US and around the world. I'm just going to mention two of them because otherwise we'd be sitting here for the entire time. One is Code Switch, presented by the Bronx Museum in 2020. This featured his quilt-based art. And the second I'm mentioning is Sweet Funk, an introspective, which I organized with Sanford at the Brooklyn Museum in 2011. Sanford is also a musician and performer. And as Zoe said, Dominique grew up in Canada and received, I think Ottawa, and received a BAA from Sheridan College Institute of Technology and Design in Oakville, Canada. Last year, she presented A Tale of Ancestral Memories at Rockefeller Center, a major, I will say epic, installation of paintings and objects. This was her first foray into public art, and so I'm looking forward to hearing her compare notes with Sanford, who also presented at Rockefeller Center, I think in 2021. I saw her show It's Not Polite to Stare in 2021 as a show that went up as we were coming out of the pandemic. It was at Jeffrey Deitch Gallery. It made a huge impression on me, and because of that, I invited her cold, out of the blue, to see if she might like to take part in Platform, and of course I was completely thrilled that she said yes. So this is an opportunity for the artists to speak about the works on view and Platform, for you to hear what they have to say. And Sanford's going to kick off with Mirror, and then, about 5 minutes. And then Dominique will talk about her piece. Then we'll talk a bit about Dominique's practice at large, and then jump back to Sanford. And there will be some time for questions at the end. So let's see if I can get this first image. Green button. Oh, I'm ahead of myself. Okay, because I'm looking at, there we go. Right, we're going to start with you first. Mirror. Yeah. Which I hope some of you, there's this lovely image, but I hope some of you had an opportunity to see it in person. Everything always looks so much better in person than in images.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. And just to reiterate, please go by and see our works over in the platform section before
Last
you leave.
chance.
What's that? Yeah. So yes, the work here, as Eugenie mentioned, is called Mirror. And this body of work, which I'll call the Chimera series, came about when I was living in Rome, doing the American Academy in Rome Fellowship a few years ago. It was in 2017, to be exact. And I had just finished doing a series of works called the BAM series. When we show the images later, I'll show you some images from that, where I decided to basically take on figurative sculpture very directly. For many, many years, I tried to avoid direct imagery of the figure and deal with more abstract or illusory imaging to the figure. But after the sort of spate of viewing videos of black people being killed by the police, I started to address the figure in the work as a response to that. So I did some bronze works that were made by taking African objects, dipping them in wax, and then taking them to a shooting range and shooting them with different caliber weapons in a way of sculpting. So I was using a gun as a sculpting tool. And as you can imagine, it was a very violent body of work. So now I was in Italy, and I was reflecting on that and wanting to further explore the figure, but in a different tone. And I was surrounded by, ruins of various classical, canonical works all throughout the city. And I was wondering how black bodies might look in marble, and black bodies missing heads and arms and limbs and so on, would they carry the same type of, let's say, gravitas that we give to those European works? So with that thought process, I started to make marble pieces. I first started with parts of bodies, and then I started working with African masks, and then later I started combining classical, canonical Greco-Roman forms with hybrid African masks. So that's what you're seeing right here with Mirror. And as I got into that, I started to realize the issues that were coming to me were really strictly formal. I think the project was so front-loaded with, very conceptual ideas that it allowed me the freedom to really experiment with what it means for hands to be in one position and the neck to be cocked a different way and eyes open or eyes closed and all the subtleties that really go back to classical figurative sculpture in the first place.
Could we back up to your Chimera just for a second? One of the things that doesn't come across in this image is the beauty of the stone and how the color is so flesh-like and marbled with veins in the way that skin is. And so it's a process question because people ask me about it, and I'm kind of like, well, I'm not really sure. So let me ask Sanford, where do you source the stone, and what's the process that takes place between the block of stone, or is this marble?
This is marble. This is a Turkish pink marble. I've also worked with Portuguese pink marble several times. And the process usually entails me going to the quarries that I work with, which are located near Forti del Marmi, outside of Tuscany, northern Italy. And I usually go and pick the slabs with the quarry, and it really depends on what's available at any given time. And we have to consider the scope or the scale of the project and whether it would be one stone or multiple stones. So once that process happens. It's a back and forth for several months, even sometimes years, and the process combines digital aspects, robots, and then all the way back to hand finishing, hand carving, hand figuration. So it really encapsulates the entire, I guess, historical spectrum of figurative sculpting. And I sometimes, it depends on the piece. And once again, this is a chimera, this is a series. I've made probably up to date close to 20, 25 different forms. Sometimes I let certain computer glitches show up because I find it somehow interesting to render computer glitches by hand versus the computer rendering human glitches. So I like to vacillate between that, and I like toying with the idea of working with archaic classical techniques and extremely contemporary, modern, even futuristic techniques. And at the end of the day, none of that is necessarily apparent unless you're really, really looking closely at the details, like the skin and the cloth and all of those aspects. But I consider these works to be power objects that might be understood best by a future ethnography. And with that being said, that future ethnography has to sort of take into consideration all the various means and technologies used to create the forms.
Well, I know it's from the Chimera series, and I had to look it up. What is a chimera?
Yes.
So,
Well, there are several definitions of a chimera. The definition that is most important to me regarding this work is a chimera as a shape-shifting hybrid creature that can change forms between dragon and lion and horse or man or serpent or bird and so on. So chimeras are also sometimes considered either good omens or bad omens. There are also monsters, and I also call these figures monsters, and monsters don't always appear scary or ugly or disturbing. Sometimes they're quite beautiful, but really the monster or the monstrosity that I'm interested in here is the monster created by millennia of human interaction and cross-cultural pollination, the monsters that history creates.
thanks, Sanford. So let's move over to Dominique, who is going to tell us a bit about Marketplace.
Yeah, Marketplace. I think similar to Sanford, I was looking at these Roman sculptures and mostly European paintings for years. I hadn't considered my own culture's sculptures and paintings, and I had an epiphany one day at the Met, and I decided to not go into the European section, just spend the day in the Chinese section, in the Korean section, the African section. And I'd realized that these objects are, there's so much history, there's so much just memory seeped in all these objects. And for me, I was like, well, why isn't anybody else considering these objects, right? Perhaps remaking them, perhaps painting them. And so I started making these small paintings of these objects from the Shang Dynasty, from the Han Dynasty, and slowly became just enthralled and obsessed. I then started going on to like Sotheby's, Phillips, onto these auction sites and wanting to maybe perhaps owning some of these objects so that I could just live with them, be with them, and to paint them. And so that's kind of where my journey began with looking at these objects. And so what you're seeing here at the Marketplace is me trying to tap into those histories through remaking objects from this time period. So half of the objects are from the Shang Dynasty, which is the first categorized dynasty in China, and the Han Dynasty, which are the pagodas that I had made. And the pagodas, at the time when they were created, these small versions of it were to, I don't know if it was to help like deities or the immortals to be placed within the
Are they funerary monuments? Do they get put into tombs sometimes?
Yeah, they would be put into tombs so that if they were buried with the person who had passed away, that they would, perhaps ascend to become a deity. And so a lot of the work is just trying to tap into that ancestral memory or history, and then also thinking about so they're all in vitrines, so I made these plexi boxes, and I wanted to make it look like a little museum, thinking about what gets categorized and what gets what is allowed to be saved and what is allowed to continue to live on in our collective memory. Thinking about what gets shown at museums, what gets just saved for future generations.
When we first were in touch with this, you mentioned the marketplace, and you had mentioned wet markets in Asia. And of course, it was, some people believe that wet markets were the source of the COVID-19 virus. And then, and I know you had mentioned some food and marketplaces as places that are social for communities, that are places where ideas are exchanged, people crossing the country or, who come through. Also places to obtain food, to make meals for friends and family and, sustain your family. So when the crate arrived and you took the piece out, I was like, oh, you made a museum. So I know artists always, nothing emerges fully formed, and it's a process. So I was just wondering if there was anything that prompted, your slight shift in thinking to include not only the wet market, but also the idea of the museum as a kind of marketplace.
Yeah, I think the reason why I wanted to juxtapose those two elements is because thinking about, wet markets and places of, like a farmer's market where people go get food for sustenance, how that is seen over here in the West, right? There's this dialogue of these markets being a filthy place, a dirty place, a place that's contaminated. Whereas then it's almost, we're nitpicking what is allowed to be viewed or what is allowed to be tasteful here over in the West. So there's this fixation on, wanting to excavate and take these objects, right, to buy it and to place it in these institutions. But then when it comes to, a marketplace like food, it's seen as lowbrow or, a place of contamination.
Thanks. So let's see how this relates to your larger practice. Some of you may know, if you're familiar with Dominique's work, you might think of her as a painter. And in both her painting and her installations, and this is, I think, the room from It's Not Polite to Stare, you'll see bird cages and other objects. I'm always struck by your choice of objects and the deliberateness of what you select. Some of the objects seem to be found, and some are objects you make. Each one of these objects, it makes me think of a novel or maybe a film. Each object seems to be almost a character in a narrative that you've created. So I wonder if you could just speak a bit about how you find your objects or how they find you and how you put them all together. First, let's say your installations, and then, because they also appear in your paintings.
Yeah, this installation I made, this was in 2021. I had gone to Hong Kong maybe several years prior to that, and there was this park that I had stumbled upon, and they had these rods that kind of ran through the park, and I saw elderly folks hook little bird cages onto these hooks, and there were little birds within the bird cages, and I had asked somebody, why are you doing this? Like, why are you bringing your birds to the this park? And he said that this is a bird park, and actually because our birds at home don't get to commune with other animals, so we bring them to the park so that they can converse with each other. And I thought that was so beautiful.
Space.
Yeah, and it was this act of, them wanting their animals to commune, when in reality it was for them to perhaps connect with other people at the park. And so I wanted to recreate something similar at the gallery, and first I sourced the bird cages, and all the bird cages were actually, I found them over here in estate sales in America. So I'm not 100% sure where they're all actually from, because when I had read the description, a lot of times it just said somewhere in China, which I also find fascinating, where we can't really pinpoint where these objects are from, but they are most likely from Guangdong or Hong Kong area, because that's where most of these bird cages are created. And so with that, then based on the sizes of each of the bird cage, I then started to reference some objects from catalogs that I had looked up. And I wanted each one to have kind of a character or an essence to them, where they're all different, but perhaps they're having conversations with each other.
So how would you characterize the relationship between your sculpture or objects and the paintings you make?
I think they're in the same world. I'm really trying not to make objects that I don't want somebody to look at my objects and be like, oh, that's just her painting as an object. I really try to separate the two worlds. That's something that I'm negotiating right now. But they come from the same place, right? I think they come from, I've been mostly looking at sculptures. I actually haven't been looking at paintings quite as much in the recent, 2 to 3 years. And so maybe perhaps that language, flows a little bit better, just because I think if I was only looking at painting, then maybe the sculptures would emulate the paintings a little bit too much, and vice versa.
That makes sense, okay.
Oh yeah, so these are just each of the objects.
Oh, and you made the ceramic objects in the bird that you
Yeah,
put
so
in?
all the bird cages are found. This is a found object. Which when I found it, I was like, this is insane looking that somebody had created this for their bird. We could talk about painting a little bit. This was created for a show curated by Jeffrey Deitch. It was, what was that Manet painting called? Luncheon on the Grass. So it was based off of Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. And I honestly didn't really know how to approach this painting when I had first started, and so I decided to give myself the parameter of making it the exact same size of the painting that Manet had made it. So I sat there in the studio with this blank canvas, sitting there. I was like, what would Manet do? And then I just thought of these people sitting on the picnic blanket consuming food, and the consumption. I was just thinking, and there was a nude woman, so I was thinking about the consumption of the body. And so I made this painting where there's arms and legs, and they're all kind of grabbing at the center of this woman's body to talk about his painting.
You're very interested in food.
Yes, I love food. I think the next painting is also about food.
Yeah. Yeah, the sausage forms are very similar to those in Marketplace.
Yes, and so, yeah, when I had made the sausages, I was thinking about this painting that I had made, and I think this was 2021 as well, or 2022. And again, think about communion of people celebrating, eating the foods that are from your culture, and celebrating it. This is also from 2021 at Deitch. I mean, this is moving away from food, but I was thinking a lot about scale in this one. I think this, at the time, this was the largest work that I had made to date.
How large is it approximately?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know.
The thing about images is like,
Just, it's big, I think.
could be very small, could be enormous.
Yeah.
The classical head in the background.
Yeah, I think I was thinking these were early ideas of, like these European sculptures, going back to that idea of, what I was prioritizing and what I was looking at and trying to kind of contend with, being brought up here in the West and having that lens and figuring out how to make work with that identity.
Maybe we could turn to your piece at Rockefeller Center, which is epic, vast.
Yeah.
And how did this work come into being? It was Rockefeller Center commissioned it with the Art Production Fund?
Yes, yes. Also, our production fund was with you as well, right? This was my first public arts project. I had never done anything like this. When they had approached me, I went for a site visit, and they showed me this long hallway. And my initial gut reaction was to reuse and repurpose some of my previous works that I've done, because mentally to repaint an entire block of work, I couldn't mentally, I couldn't mentally I didn't want to do it. And then I walked down the hall and I was like, fuck, I'm gonna do it.
I mean, where do you start with something like this?
Yeah,
And
so
it's
30 panels, it's 88 feet long, and so when I had said the previous painting was the largest painting, this is actually my longest painting. And I don't think I really understood what I got myself into until the canvases arrived to the studio. And it came in a crate, and they brought it up and it filled, half of my studio, and I was like, I don't think I can actually do this, but somehow I disassociated and I finished it somehow.
So it's a large narrative, and it seems like each narrative panel is a triptych. So it has 3 parts separated by the frame.
There's actually 7. So there's 7 narratives broken up into 7 pieces because of just the way that each of the how the hallway is laid out.
And how did you decide what stories to tell? How to create a narrative like that? Can you walk us through the narrative?
I think I brought in all the elements that I had been painting in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, and I wanted to create this long story, thinking about it kind of like a scroll. So as you walk, the story slowly reveals itself as if you're opening a scroll up. And I wanted to begin the story with 4 women. These women are they're sea women who from Jeju Island in Korea, who kind of provide for their community through deep sea diving and collecting shells and food and fish. And so I started with that idea and then slowly thought about, okay, well, perhaps it then goes onto a boat and then, to a shore and to a marketplace. And then at the end, the horses are kind of riding off with this market.
So it's kind of an economy or yes, or?
Yeah, a little bit, I guess, yeah. I don't think I was thinking about it in that way when I was making it. A lot of my work it really is very intuitive. It starts from one place and it slowly kind of grows into something else.
Oh wow, wait, you made some objects I know that accompanied this.
Yeah, these are 3 windows, and I created sculptures for it. This was my first time having fabricators help me, and then working with assistants on creating molds and things like that, which was a challenge for me, but it was definitely a learning experience.
I know you worked as an animator at one point in your life, and I'm wondering if you feel that that impacted your interest in storytelling at all. Yeah, just curious.
I never worked as an animator. I had fantasies of becoming an animator. I really wanted, I did a lot of concept art when I was younger, and my dream was to work for Pixar. And so I had applied to Pixar, and they rejected me, fortunately, unfortunately. And I think that does help me make images, just because I think a lot of my paintings I think of them as theatrical, and I think about the lighting, I think about the characters, I think about how they exist in this space.
Thank you. So we're at a good place because we're at Rockefeller Center, and I think we're ready for Sanford.
Yes. Well, we'll have to get there through a couple of other pieces.
We have to get there because, well, I wanted to ask you about the term conceptual patchwork, which I've seen you in, writings about you, and curious if you could just talk a little bit about what that means.
Sure. I think I started thinking about my work as conceptual patchwork because I was having a hard time placing myself as a maker. I am influenced by so many things and inspired by so many things, and I work in many different materials and media. So ultimately, I've figured out that through all those different projects and experiments, I have the same themes going through them. So in essence, the different forms it may take are literally a patchwork to all amount to the same conceptual end. And I think it's apropos to show this. This is a piece that I had in the 2002 Whitney Biennial, which is a video installation. And when I came out of grad school, I was doing lots of video installation, lots of physical sculptural installation as well, but I was usually combining objects with video and performance. And as I started to evolve through that thought process, performance started to take on different forms. Sometimes it wasn't necessarily me or people I instructed to perform, but actually setting up environments where viewers become the performer. So in this case, you're looking at this couple sitting in this love seat in a room inside the Whitney with simulated wood panels and a shag carpet rug, and they, in essence, become performers of this piece. A very mundane family room, living room setting, watching a screen. But what you see on the screen are found footage from my childhood and my friend Jennifer Zakin, who I collaborated on for this piece, where we show Super 8 footage of our childhood. She's a Jewish woman who grew up in Connecticut. I grew up in Los Angeles. And during the summer at Skowhegan, we started, I was working with Super 8 already, and she said, my family has a whole bunch of that stuff in shoeboxes at the house. I'm like, well, let's look through them and see what happens. Luckily, we were both at the Art Institute of Chicago, so after Skowhegan, we went back, and through going through all this footage, we realized that we were doing all of the same things, learning how to play piano, trips to Hawaii, Christmas, Hanukkah, Passover, Easter, birthday parties, just mundane Americana. And we started thinking that this really could stand in for lots of other people, assuming they had the quote-unquote technology of a Super 8 film or a video recorder. They were doing all these mundane things. These are the things that we capture. So we did a split screen, basically archival production of those films. And it was so uncannily similar that at 2 points in the film, we actually cross the screens. So you see the black family and the Jewish family switch, but they're still doing the same rituals, basically. And we call the piece A Small World, and it branches into much larger ideas, but this was sort of the basis of finding a way to combine sculpture, installation, performance, moving image, sound, and so on to create conceptual patchwork. Around the same time, I was doing these projects, and I lived in Japan for 3 years in the 90s, and I became deeply influenced by Buddhism and the objects in Buddhism, mandalas and tankas, and I started doing meditation with at a shrine close to where I was living. And when I came back, I wanted to make work about that experience, but also create something that was autobiographical. And I started making dance floors, basically. So what you're looking at is an overhead bird's eye view of a hand-cut linoleum floor that's fashioned after a mandala. And mandalas are spiritual devices, diagrams showing different deities doing different actions. And instead of really depicting the figures, once again back to figuration, I took the artistic license to add some autobiography into it. I grew up in Los Angeles doing graffiti, DJing, and breakdancing. And we used to literally go to a friend's house and change our clothes and meditate and listen to music and get into a whole headspace before practicing our quote-unquote martial art of breakdancing. So there was a ritualistic thing happening already. So once I moved to New York, I started doing large-scale dance floors and taking them to big breakdancing competitions that were still happening in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, and I would install a video camera above and videotape the entire 2-hour or 3-hour event, all the different teams, all the different breakdancers. And then at the end, I would show the object, usually in a museum or an institution or a gallery, and then show the video somewhere else in that space so people could see the documentation as well. And I would invite the breakdancers to the opening. And if they wanted to perform, they could. If they didn't have to. Because already inherent with this piece, you see the scuff marks of all the footwork that already happened. So in essence, these become, the object itself is a document of what occurred. And I started thinking of these as power objects as well. And once again, staying with that circular pattern motif, this piece is called Lotus, and this is a picture of it at the Rubin Museum, which, is it still open or did it close already? It's on the verge of closing.
On the verge of closing, I think.
Right. Which is a museum here in Manhattan that is dedicated to Buddhist art. So I did this lotus blossom, once again thinking of mandalas, but as you get closer to this image, you realize that each of those petals of that lotus are actually cross-sections of slave ships. And this is how they used to depict the potential way to pack and maximize space using, maximize human cargo in the cargo holds of these ships. So it's a very seductive piece from a distance, but then also a very sort of horrific piece when you get closer. And I like that tension between seduction and repulsion. Once again, I'm also interested in the high and the low and the representative and the abstract and all these dichotomies. I was never really a polemic thinker in terms of what was the truest art form, which were conversations literally people were having when I was in grad school. I was really more interested in the intersection of things. So this piece, formal sculpture, glass engraving, but also has this very sort of historical bend to it. This image goes back to what I was speaking about before, the works I was doing before the marble piece mirror outside in platform. This is from the BAM series. This is the first one, and I just, instead of showing you the video, I just have a video still. On the left, you see this African sculpture that I've dipped in wax, and now I'm sculpting it with buckshot. In this particular one, this might have been a 12-gauge shotgun. So as a shotgun blast hits the piece, you start to see different effects as the bullets start to rip through the bodies of these figures. And I worked with a really high-speed camera that gives me the ability to slow it down so you get that point of impact. And when I show the videos, it's got this very loud sound of the bullets, and it's very violent, but I also sometimes rewind it and play it in reverse in a way of sort of bringing the bodies back into completion. So I take the remnants of that and cast them in bronze, and that's what you see on the right there. And this was the first one. This one was dedicated to Michael Brown. All these pieces are named after a victim of police brutality. And I did around 15 or so of these, and I had to make a hard stop on that project for two reasons. I didn't want to end up being the guy who just shoots African objects and makes work about that, but I also realized the sick irony of it is that I could keep making these works over and over and over and over again because this phenomenon is still happening. It's been going on for 400 years. So back to conceptual patchwork, there's history, there is, social justice, there is formalism, there's conceptual art, there's all of that is happening at once. The only sense I can make of this process of creation is patchwork. So that actually led me at some point to start making quilt pieces, which I'll show you after this. This is the Oracle that was part of the Art Production Fund project at Rockefeller Center as well. This is a 25-foot bronze piece. This is more in that Chimera series, similar to the mirror piece, where instead of shooting the objects, I started combining classical forms to create new forms. I did several other installations throughout the entire Rockefeller campus. I did the long wall as well, and some of the vitrines inside, but this was really the premier piece of that. And it was, to that point, to that date, the largest piece that I'd worked on, the largest scale that I've worked on. And this later traveled to Los Angeles to the Hammer Museum, and it was there for a year and a half, and now it is in a permanent home in Northern California at the Dunham Estate. So, storytelling, narrative, history, and this goes back to this conceptual patchwork. That lotus piece I showed you that I made in 2007, the glass piece, I took that motif again and used it along the throne. If you see right there at the edge of the throne, those are that lotus once again. When I made it in the first place, I always thought of it as a symbol or a logo that at some point I would get rid of the bodies and let the mandala actually speak to that history, but I had to foreground that conceptually by creating the glass piece. Here I take the liberty of taking the forms out of it and letting just the silhouette itself speak to that narrative. When I showed the piece in California, it's sort of hard to see, but that first image on the far left is from the ground up looking at the sculpture. So you see the sculpture way up top. There were offerings that were placed alongside it, so it became a makeshift shrine. So people literally were activating it day by leaving offerings for ancestors, friends, people who were ill, and so on. So it's a way of charging and making the piece, once again, performative. This is also part of the Chimera series. This is a 25-foot wide piece, but it's made out of a material, it's very hard to tell in the image, but it's two-sided steel discs, almost like sequins. So one side is mirrored and reflective, the other is black. So when the wind blows, these things actually shimmer and glimmer, so it really draws you in, almost looking at sunlight hit a mirror or something like that. And on the back side, there's this pattern that is derived from one of my quilt paintings, also playing with optics and perspective, which brings us to some of the quilt paintings. And once again, that lotus symbol is embedded in this. This quilt is from probably 2000, let's see, I think the date is 14, thank you. So the lotus is a recurring theme, and there was a touch of a figure in this on the lower left corner, but it's just the silhouette. So again, toying with the figure, but never really placing it in the fore or giving it full visibility.
Were wrapped around people's bodies, but the body just leaves an impression or residue.
Absolutely. So, in essence, the quilt is a performative object as well. It already implies the body just by nature of what it is, as it provides comfort for bodies. And all of that goes into larger outdoor permanent pieces that I've been working on. I'm just going to show you 2 or 3 that are from this summer. And this is at the new International Terminal at the Portland, Oregon Airport. And this is a 3-dimensional quilt piece. The image on the lower right is how it looks from the tarmac of the airport when you're flying in. It's around 80 feet. And it's suspended.
This was very recently installed.
I was installed in July. And there are 2 of these, so each of them are 80 feet. This is a smaller version, or an indoor version, let's say, of a 3-dimensional quilt where I'm actually making armatures and then applying used and antique quilts on all the facades. And this is the most recent. This was installed last weekend. This is a permanent installation in front of the new music building at MIT. And I don't think there's a video of this. No, probably not. But every facade has a different pattern, so as you walk around this in 360, you're seeing totally different colorways, so it almost seems like one side is just strictly black and white, and then you get to another angle, and then you start to see colors peek out and see a different set of patterns, and then you get on the other side, and it's a completely different piece. So it's almost as if the piece is kinetic and changing as you walk around, shape-shifting chimeras. And I included, I think this might be the last image, but one of the first combination pieces that we're dealing with the figure and the quilts at the same time. And this really sort of feeds into the mirror piece, which is showing the stone and fabric and really playing with this notion of high and low, impermanence and permanent, the quote-unquote refined and elevated masculine European sculpture with the quote-unquote domestic women's work of quilt and fabric. I don't believe in any of those dichotomous organizations, but that's how history is taught. And all that to say is that I think one of the themes that is really inherent in my work is not just history, but really more importantly, historiography. How we tell stories, how we talk about history, who writes the history, who wrongs the history, who rewrites the history, and is history ultimately open source? So these are some of the questions that are happening in my studio.
Thank you, both. I have a question about public art, though. I mean, Dominique, you're moving into the realm of public art, and Sanford, you're really kind of mining all of the opportunities, transforming some of your two-dimensional, more domestically scaled work into public, scaling it up for the public. So I'm just curious about the rewards and the challenges of working in the public. Clearly, these are long-term projects and that demand a great deal of time and logistical thought. And just as artists, how do you feel about that? What is rewarding about it? But then, do the rewards outweigh the challenges? Just curious.
Well, I'm very new to all of this. I've only really done one project. I have an upcoming project next year with the High Line, and it's going to be a performance-based project, which I've never done before. So I think for me, I want to keep my practice interesting. I want to challenge myself. I feel like it's very easy to just stay in your lane and to create what you know is comfortable. So for me, doing public art really is about challenging myself. And then also with the Rockefeller Center, I think seeing a broader audience kind of engage with the work. I had never really experienced that because I've mostly exhibited in galleries, which is a very contained space. It's, like-minded folks going into a space. And I think with public arts, I loved it. I loved people who didn't care at all and walked past it. I loved children who were fascinated and maybe pulled their parents aside for them to look at the work. Just a broader spectrum of people looking and engaging at work. I think that's what is rewarding.
I would, echo a lot of that. I agree with a lot of those feelings. I already mentioned that I used to do graffiti as a kid in LA, so I was already interested in doing public art from the get-go. And if I hadn't got busted when I was 15 and put into advanced painting classes in high school, I might have done more of it. But that got me into the quote-unquote fine arts, the indoor arts. But working on a large scale and working publicly, it opens different conversations. It does keep your practice nimble, in a sense. I think it is inherent to a sculptor to consider, of all the materials and all the things that are elements of a sculpture, scale is one of the most important. And I took a class when I was in a post-bac program that was called Minimal and Majestic. And I really started thinking about how much impact you can make with a very small object versus how much you can with a large object, and can they work on the same level? And I do believe in some ways they can. As you can tell, my work really is about making an object sort of aurate and give a type of energy off, and I think that can be done with small and large objects. But also the ability to realize these smaller forms in a large format is exciting to see how it holds a space. Like during the Rockefeller Plaza, if that piece was 5 feet smaller, it would have got lost. If it was 5 feet larger, it would have been bodacious and too much. It's about finding the sweet spot, which is particularly hard when you're working with digital models because it's never real. Just like people who experience art on Instagram, they're not really experiencing the art. So it takes a lot of time and experience to try to figure some of those things out, and it's a challenge that I like as an artist.
Thanks. We're going to open it up for a couple of questions. I just wanted to, before that, while you're thinking of your question, I'm going to say something. So I was reading Artsy online, and somebody had written, platform features 12 installations that deal directly with rethinking narratives in art history. I was going to ask both of you if you think that's an accurate description of your work. I mean, Sanford, you've already answered that. So, Dominique, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like questions like that are always. I think as makers, we're here, we're existing, we're creating, we're reflecting on what we're experiencing, and I think those larger, broader questions are for, curators and other people who then categorize us to answer. That's how I feel about it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I selected artists who I felt were engaged with their personal histories, which often offer portals to cultural histories, but that I wasn't really thinking about, rewriting art history.
Yes, exactly.
But it's always interesting to see that in print and go, oh.
It's a very heavy. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so are there any questions out there on this final hour of the Armory Show? Yes. Oh, I think there's a microphone.
That's right, I'll put it.
It's really bad acoustics in here. You'll need.
Hello? Okay. Wow, loud. Dominique, I was really interested in when you showed some of those paintings from Deitch, that there seemed to be that stacked perspective that you see in traditional Japanese painting and Chinese painting, but then you switch back and forth between that vanishing perspective. And as you've talked about, it's kind of like a relationship between your Western upbringing and your cultural. I was just interested in your thoughts about that. Is that just completely intuitive, or was there some intent there?
Sorry, say that again. Stacking.
The perspective where, for example, I don't know if there's that piece. When you were talking, the ones that particularly speak about food, and there's that one that really references, to me at least, some Japanese prints where you have this traditional Asian perspective, which is stacked rather than vanishing point, Western perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely reference Chinese paintings in terms of the kind of these angles that are flattened with very little shadows. That's just me giving a nod to Chinese calligraphy paintings or like Japanese printmaking.
Thank you. Very quickly, I just wanted to say, Dominique, I saw your work in Art Basel in Basel, and I didn't know about your work before, and I thought it was fabulous. And then I saw a gallerist representing you, and I said, well, I just saw this long panel of characters. I don't know what I'm looking at. She's like, yeah, she's great. You go, does she have a good art lawyer? She said, she has the best art lawyer. Congratulations, you do have the best art lawyer.
Thank you, I do.
My question, I think it's important. My question is, who is helping the two of you? Because both of you are, I think I'm super lucky. I came in with my friends, and both of you are here speaking about the art that I saw and that is going to stick with me. So who is helping you, other than your teachers and your parents, I suppose, to get to where you are? Rockefeller Center is not too shabby. So who's helping? Thank you both.
Definitely my art lawyer. She approached me years ago, and she was like, you need to be protected. I didn't really understand what she meant at the time. And she was like, I'm not going to really charge you, and I'm just going to help you. So we started small projects, and she's been guiding me through the process. Additionally, I think having good galleries really helps. With Massimo De Carlo, I generally bounce ideas with them, and they've really guided me. And then in terms of our production fund, I'm not sure how they found my work, but that was just through probably peers or like friends sharing the work. It has felt just very natural, and it's progressed at a good pace, I think, for me, for my career.
I would consider my first professional exhibition probably in 2000 or so. So lots of years of trial and error. I also taught at many schools for many years before I had gallery representation, and very deliberately did a lot of residencies and fellowships where I was able to meet curators and get into exhibitions, and when I was lucky, from time to time, sell works directly to museums and institutions. So I sort of went through the back door and didn't go directly through the commercial system for quite some time. As I mentioned, I was in the biennial in 2002, but I had my first New York gallery show in 2017. But by 2017, I'd probably done close to 10 museum solos, including the one we did together at the Brooklyn Museum. So patience helped. And talking to lots and lots of friends, specifically artists, because every artist will tell you a different story because our trajectories are so different. Luckily, having great relationships with great people who trust, support, and believe in art and artists and are not exploitative. We both share a gallery with Massimo De Carlo, who, which is great for both of us. I actually have a lot of affinities with the way you think about making. I geeked out on tons of your interviews, and I'm like, that. So yes, time, patience, and chess, not checkers.
I'd like to thank our artists, Sanford and Dominique, for their wonderful conversation, and thank you all for coming. So you have about an hour to race around the fair and catch those last works.